big part of the South African economy is made up of goods. Those goods need to reach from point A to point B. From the mineral sector to the agriculture sector, these goods are often transported by truck drivers, drivers that have to cover long distances and very long hours. In today's show, we take a look at truck drivers, their general working conditions, and what needs to be done on that front to improve those working conditions. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress.
Welcome to the weekly social justice TV show right here on Cape Town TV. This is a Workers' World Media Productions show, and thank you very much for having joined us as we particularly take a look at the road truck transport industry, which is essential for the South African economy and the distribution of goods, of services, and people alike, and companies in South Africa. Truck drivers are the workers that certainly ensure that this happens on time. However, their work often entails very difficult and dangerous conditions. Join us on today's show as we unpack the state of the trucking industry, the workers that keep the wheels moving, and the measures that is required to support, and more so the support provided by the unions as well as the law. All right, we have with us to have this discussion Willie Lakwati from the National Road and Freight sector, part of the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union, SATAW. Thank you very much, certainly, for having joined us here today. Let's start off by looking at the sector. Give us a bit of a background to how saturated or how big the trucking industry is in South Africa at the moment.
No, thanks very much, and thanks for having us. Good morning, everyone. Just quickly, a bit of background. Road freight and logistics industry employs 127,319 employees. The number that I'm reflecting on refers to your drivers, general workers, data captures, and all categories, of course, which constitute 128,390.
Okay, sorry, just give that number again. What is that? Just repeat that number for us.
The number, the industry employs 127,319 employees.
Do we know from that number how many of them constitute actual truck drivers?
It varies from one another on the basis that some of the companies are not yet registered with the council and cannot be counted for. But in the meantime, what we are doing, we are conducting inspection across the country to ensure that those affiliated companies who belongs to the scope of the council or the industry perhaps are registered with the council so that we can have a full, accurate number.
And how does the ownership model work in the sector? Of course, you have scenarios, as you've just highlighted, companies that aren't quite registered because, you know, some guy buys a truck, for instance, and he gets a driver to drive it, or he rents it out, and, you know, it plays a particular part within the broader scheme of the trucking industry. What is the balance of people that are independently owners of trucks and then, you know, happens to just have, let's say, a one-man operation, for instance? Is that quite widespread?
No, currently, those who are recognized and registered with the council as truck owners constitute 96,000.
Okay, and how are workers structured? Their contracts, are a great deal of them in possession of an employment contract? And then how does that employment contract contemplate, for instance, their working hours? What's the average working hours of a truck driver?
The main collective agreement of road freight and logistics industry dictates and gives obligations to the employers across the industry with minimum hours of work, which talks to us that hours of work on a daily basis should not exist 15 hours a day.
Is that the average 15 hours a day that a truck driver would usually work?
Yes, this average that we are reflecting on seeks to talk to us that it should be 9 hours a day and not exist 15 hours a day.
Okay, but surely that is a lot more than what is the allowable amount of time that a worker is supposed to be at work, or does that not quite apply here?
No, that is inclusive of overtime, which is something that is not working day. It's not applicable daily, of course.
Okay, and the overtime, how is it then usually documented and is it paid? Is there a strong culture of you work X amount of hours per month or per week, and whatever is over and above that, that is calculated and workers are generally receiving their overtime?
Yes, of course. Perhaps let me paint picture on you in that hours of work as regulated by the main collective agreement is 9 hours a day, and hours beyond that is overtime, of course. Now, employers within the industry vary from one another in terms of their operational requirements and the schemes that have introduced, of course. In the main collective agreement, there's this clause called Clause 35. It talks about the incentive scheme. Incentive scheme means that an employer is allowed to introduce an incentive scheme provided that the incentive scheme is in consultation with worker representatives and the union, of course, in terms of the amendment of that scheme, if perhaps the employees or the drivers in that particular companies are associated themselves under the auspices of any union. That is why we've made that addition. So schemes vary from one another. You will find that the schemes talks about load system, others talks about overtime arrangement. But the reality is that whenever one introduces the incentive scheme, that particular incentive scheme must ensure that it complies with clause 11, 12, 13, and 14 of the basic condition of employment. The clauses that I'm referring to of the basic condition of employment refers to overtime, weekend work, including public holidays.
Yeah, including, of course, the allocation of how many hours they are meant to be working. In terms then of that Basic Conditions of Employment Act and how it correlates with what I understand to be, and maybe you can clarify this for us, is there a high proportion of workers that are migrants, foreigners, and oftentimes, would be receiving a lesser wage than what locals would? Is that a common practice in the industry?
Yes, what I would say is that there is a clause as well a clause as well within the main collective agreement which talks about the prohibition of employment of foreign nationals. Now, we have been engaging at the centralized bargaining process with regards to amending that clause so that it's in line with Immigration Act number 13 of 2002, including Employment Service Act. And what we are doing currently, we are participating in the ministerial trust team that has been established by the president, sometimes in 2021, looking into those aspects, of course. But the reality is that where we are not organized in a particular company, we are unable to determine as to whether the employers comply with the legislative framework or not.
Yeah,
But the
and
areas
maybe just
that
to
the
pause,
areas that
just
we'll be able to determine is where we are organized, and we're
sure.
working very hard
Then
to
maybe
ensure
just to
that
pause
they
on that
comply.
point, I want to highlight whether or not, of course, as the industry is widely saturated with migrants, what level of compliance would there then be? We'll try and establish the answer to that question once we do return from the break. We are talking about the trucking industry. Wali Lekhwati is with us from the South African Transport and Allied Workers Union. We are talking, of course, before we went to the break, looking at the saturation of migrants or foreigners that are in the sector that have proven to be a bone of contention for locals, at least some locals, as it were. And part of what we've learned from this episode is that a lot of times these workers are paid a lesser wage than what they would pay for South Africans. And this has been a particular issue that has led to even violence within the industry. And without getting too deep into that issue, since it's not really our focus here today, that issue, though, does place workers in a bit of a precarious position in which sometimes they do get injured on the workplace or they do get attacked, etc. What has been the practice by the employers to compensate those workers when they do get injured while performing their duties?
Not all of them are complying with the relevant legislation, of course, but we must indicate that most of them do assist in terms of our analysis and practically so. But once again, where we are not organized, we are unable to determine as to whether there is compliance in relation to the relevant legislative framework or not. But we can confirm that most of them do comply and assist, and this is because we are engaging them in that this is what is supposed to be done by them as well. Thank you.
Okay, so if they are compliant and from those businesses where the truck drivers were perhaps attacked or got into an accident or, while trying to, I don't know, what some of the typical injuries are for truck drivers, and maybe you can give us those details, but where there have been injuries, do you know whether applications were made to the compensation fund for compensation, this using COIDA?
Yes, yes. No. Application has been made. As indicated, application has been made, and this is through pressure from us. Once we receive a complaint from our members, being drivers, of course.
Okay, so talk us through that application process. You say applications have been made. I would understand that, of course, a medical report would have to be acquired. The employer would have to submit those forms, etc. As that happened in the cases that you are aware about?
Yeah, it does happen. It does definitely does happen. And some say we do have confirmations from drivers being our members. But once again, colleagues, where we are not organized, we are unable to ensure that the employers does comply with
No,
COIDA.
I fully understand that. I think there are limitations there. But I'd like to understand a little bit about COIDA, because I'm, of course, trying to inform the viewers here that there is this compensation fund where if you contract an injury or a disease in the workplace, that you are able to apply to the compensation fund for some sort of a benefit there. So from the cases that you are aware about, how did the process work, and can you confirm that workers actually receive payments, and what sort of amounts are we looking at?
Yeah, we can confirm that application is made one, and then workers receive compensation, but it varies from injury to one another. But the reality is that in terms of compensation, the employers are obliged to pay 75% of the employee's salary in a situation where an employee or a driver is injured.
Okay, and what are the typical injuries that a driver would contract or receive or get themselves into while being a truck driver at work?
The reason that I'm saying injuries varies from one another is because if you are badly injured, which led to disable, of course, one being disabled, obviously, there's money allocated in terms of one has to earn 2 times his annual salary based on the provident fund arrangement and also the rough issue. Where there is a minor injury, of course, this is what I'm reflecting in terms of 75% payment arrangement by the employer, of course.
Okay, is the pay for truck drivers fairly standardized? The take-home salary, is there a median, a sectoral determination, which I don't quite think it applies here, but you can correct me. Is there some sort of a baseline for what truck drivers, again, the ones that you represent, what they ought to be earning?
Yes, of course. I'm proud to pronounce that the main collective agreement prescribe the minimum wage for each driver, depending on the category. Because remember, you'll have your code 10 driver, code 8, code 10, and code 14 driver. And code 14 driver also varies from one another in that you will have extra heavy motor vehicle driver and also ultra heavy motor vehicle driver. So, but the minimum, in essence, the minimum prescribed by the main collective agreement is there and is contained in Schedule 5 of the main collective agreement.
Okay, and is there a scale? Because you're saying there's a minimum, and of course, you say there's also the categories, of course, that we're talking about, the different codes that drivers would be driving on in terms of their licensing. Is that, a determination that is communicated to employers generally? Is it a guideline from the Labour Department, or is this dependent on what sort of negotiations do happen?
Normally, when we enter into centralized wage negotiations, which ultimately lead us to signing a settlement agreement, what we normally do as the industry, we issue a circular to all industry employers and employees, so that these are the changes in terms of amendment which you need to comply with. Each and every amendment circular is issued to that effect, so that compliance can be properly being enforced and monitored, of course.
Yeah. Okay, that's an important bit to note, the compliance and the monitoring, because once I do come back from the break, I want to begin to establish what the challenges are with regards to the rising cost of fuel. Has this particularly impacted or hindered the ability of the industry to survive? And when so it does go through trouble, the first, of course, that is get cuts would be workers. And so the conversation that I want to pick up after the break is, what sort of impact has the rising cost of fuel, for instance, have on this sector, and particularly the wages of those truck drivers? That and more after the break. Do stay with us. It is Workers' World. We are talking about the truck driving industry and the impact that sometimes these workers have to endure while continuing to extol their labor. Sometimes they have to work up to 15 hours a day, and that 15 hours, we hope and pray that most of it is accounted, of course, with overtime, which, of course, the representative here from Satao is telling us is the case. And, of course, the industry also has a high saturation of workers that are not unionized, and they seem to be not necessarily part of the level of monitoring and compliance that can be conducted. How is monitoring and compliance happening, Willie, in terms of the Labour Department and ensuring that workers have the necessary tools to perform their jobs, so safety or hazardous equipment that that they work with, whether they have the resources to be able to work with them, etc., and other bits of compliance around labour law, for instance. Is there a general, well-practiced level of monitoring and compliance from the Labour Department?
Let me quickly start with the bargaining council. What we have now as the council is that we are having the agents of the council which monitor compliance and ensure enforcement. Now, what happened is that since there's this issue of foreign nationals, we then now engage Department of Transport and Department of Employment and Labor to say most of the complaints that are coming from drivers emanates from trucks that are not roadworthy. One, two, the manner in which the inspectors from the Department of Employment and Labor are conducting inspection to various companies. We then agree at the interministerial task team to say we need to have a joint inspection, and we are calling it multidisciplinary joint inspection, which consists of the bargaining council, trade unions that are registered with the bargaining council, Department of Transport, Department of Employment and Labor, Department of Home Affairs. So in those multidisciplinary joint task team, we are looking at non-compliance in terms of the Immigration Act, as indicated earlier on, and also the Employment Service Act, and also the compliance in relations to the main collective agreement of road freight and logistics industry. So you will have also the RMTC department, which will now check the roadworthiness of the vehicles that the drivers are driving, of course. So there are outcomes to that effect, which this is a continuous thing, but outcomes are there, which I can share with you in terms of the inspections that have been conducted, where you'll find that in this particular province, we found that there are 70 illegal immigrants which are driving without valid documentation. Of course, you'll find that company A and B are not complying with the relevant legislation, in particular with those who govern the employment and labor, of course.
Okay, and what happens when they're not compliant? What sort of steps are taken against them?
It is an administrative issue which we have tabled at the interministerial task team, because we are not happy as organized labor in that you'll find that company A is not complying with Immigration Act, for example. Then they will then issue a fine of 30,000, which it's just something that we are discussing, because we are not happy based on that, in that if I'm not complying and I have 30,000, it means I will pay and start and continue not to comply. One of our recommendations as trade union, and of course advocated by SATAW, is that this type of companies must completely close down until such time they confirm that they will be able to comply, so that this does not become a precedent. Most of the companies will start to realize and show that and knows that, of course, if I don't comply, this is one of the effects that I'll be confronted with.
Okay, and has that happened? Look, I mean, this has been a very serious issue of not just non-compliance, but the level of friction that it has caused, or friction rather, that it has caused within the local economy and between Africans, as it were, because it then turns out to be about, you know, who gets the job and so on and so forth. And sometimes you have, you know, inter-country driving that happens, you know, to Lesotho, to Namibia, to parts of SADC, etc. And oftentimes they do get attacked on the way as well. What, if any, measures are being put in place to protect against that?
No, look, one needs not to be viewed as if perhaps is acting or responding xenophobic. But the reality is that the Immigration Act number 13 of 2002 is very crystal clear and precise. And also the Employment Act is very clear in that there are certain aspects that employers, before employing a foreign national, must consider. Now, the friction that has been caused, which we have observed, is based on the fact that employers within the industry are not complying. That is why in the ministerial task team, we have ensured that the employer associations, which is NIASA, RFA, and CO, are part of the ministerial task team so that they can talk to their members as well to say, what we are doing is completely incorrect. But the reality is that in relation to the levels of attack, we need to be honest to one another because sometimes we might not have jurisdiction as organized labor on the basis that it relates to crime in itself. So therefore, the police should be involved and assist us so that we manage this kind of frictions and attack, of course.
Yeah. All right. What can you do as a TAU to force the issue around well, you can't force anyone, but the issue around representation, because without getting that sort of information about those that aren't quite registered, we sit with an unregulated part of the labor force for truck drivers. What efforts are underway to ensure that you get them into your stable?
No. What we have done, and I'm not saying what are we going to do. I'm saying what we have done so far. We have developed a program countrywide, which seeks to depict awareness program. In that, drivers must know as to what is the bargaining council, what is who are parties to the council. What are the benefits of the council? Who negotiated those benefits? So okay. What is the reason for them to associate themselves under the auspices of the unions that are parties to the council? Yeah. Because obviously by associating yourselves under the auspices of the unions that are parties to the council, you are likely to have give mandate to us as to how we should negotiate better conditions of employment. But if you are not,
that perhaps is as an interim a solution to look at, even while there may not be union representation, but at least those interests can be represented at the bargaining council so that we can move forward the type of benefits and working conditions that truck drivers ought to work under. With that being said, thank you once again for having tuned in to Workers' World. Until we chat again, have a lovely day. Bye-bye.